Number one, in the name of Deputy Matt Carthy, to discuss the European Commission's REACH Committee's recent adopt of a regulation on the use of lead gunshot. The Deputy has the usual 4 minutes, and Minister Ford to reply.
And I want to record my thanks to the Cancórla for selecting this item, which is of great concern to tens of thousands of people across the country. I'm glad that Minister Noonan is here. You'll recall, Minister, that we discussed this matter in a topical issues debate on the 16th of July this year. And during that debate, I requested that you consult those people who would be affected by the regulation that seeks to ban the use of lead shot bullets. Ceachta Circle Clark was also here. She raised issues regarding to the presumption of guilt that this regulation would introduce, and that the Ramsar definition of wetlands is intended for use on a global level, not local, regional or even national. Minister, at that stage you acknowledged the challenge the regulation would pose to farmers and gun owners. You acknowledged the challenges of the Ramsar definition as well as the buffer zones. And people were assured, I can tell you, Minister, when you acknowledged and accepted those concerns. And you went on to say on that occasion, while the Commission has proposed to progress this matter, I believe it is time we receive some support in this area. You told us that you are more than happy to meet with the lobby on this issue. Minister, following that, I emailed you to formally invite you to meet with the groups such as the National Association of Regional Game Councils, and I didn't receive a response. On September the 3rd, Cathaoirleach, Ireland voted in the REACH Committee to support this regulation. Despite several attempts to get clarification from the Minister's office, it was September the 15th, via response to a parliamentary question that I had submitted, that we received confirmation that Ireland had voted to support this regulation. And all of the evidence suggests that the Irish position was changed at the direction of the Minister. And if that's the case, I have to say and put on the record of this House that I'd consider that to be an act of bad faith, as do the thousands of farmers and gun owners who will be impacted. And I've no doubt that we're going to hear now that all will be well and that any issues arising will be handled during the transitionary phase. And I don't believe that that will be the case. I fear that it is the intention of the Government to overcome the challenges that are posed by the Ramsar definition and buffer zones by banning the sale and use of lead gunshot entirely. And if that's not the intention, then I'd invite the Minister to outline how it could possibly be workable to implement this regulation in Ireland. I have a letter here from the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, as it was known then, dating back to June, where it states, and again I quote, "The various issues raised by Ireland relating to a longer lead-in time for member states without restrictions and issues surrounding buffer zones around wetlands do not appear to have been addressed by the Commission in the current draft of the regulation. Accordingly, Ireland is unable to support the current regulation in its current form unless changes are made to address these concerns." Minister, I have to ask you, what changes were made from the time of this letter, or was it simply a case that your position changed and then the Government's changed? Because people will be really interested in hearing your response to this, particularly as I have emails from the National Parks and Wildlife Service just days before the September vote indicating to me that Ireland would reiterate our concerns at the meeting of September the 3rd. So, Minister, I'd like to ask you, how did this draft differ from the previous? What date did Ireland formally change and reverse the position? And did you, Minister, intervene to sign us up to a position that will create substantial difficulties and costs to Irish farmers and game club members without any consultation with them whatsoever?
Thank you, Deputy. And
Cathaoirleach, and thank Deputy Carthy for bringing this question to today. The matter was, as he's correct to saying, discussed as a topical issue back on 16th of July when both Deputies Carthy and Clark raised it then, and it is good and important that we do discuss it again here today. I just want to just update the House as well, just in terms of the background to this issue. As I indicated in July, the agreement on the conservation of the African Eurasian migratory water birds, AEWA, was developed under the UN Convention on Migratory Species. Ireland signed up to the agreement in 2003. The agreement includes a commitment that parties shall endeavour to phase out the use of lead shot for hunting in wetlands as soon as possible in accordance with self-imposed and published timetables. I am happy that Ireland's position is to support the commitment and to phase out the use of lead shot over wetlands. Separately and directly related to our discussion here this evening, the European Commission published a set of draft regulations in early 2019 for consideration by Member States on the use of lead shot in and around wetlands. The draft regulations was discussed by Member States at some meetings of the European Committee of the Registration, Evaluation, Authorisation and Restriction of Chemicals, more commonly referred to as the REACH Committee, as Deputy Carthy has said. Following discussions at a meeting of the REACH Committee last June, and submitted a draft set of regulations for a vote by Member States by written procedure. The main proposals in the regulation involve firstly, a transitional period of 24 months for Member States banning the use of lead shots in guns in and around wetlands. And secondly, for Member States with wetlands which exceed 20% of their territory, the transition time is extended to 36 months, provided Member States also ban the purchase and use of lead shot in all territory, not just on wetlands. Thirdly, fixed buffer zones of 100 metres around wetlands where lead shot possession and shooting would be prohibited. And finally, a definition of wetlands that is used in the Ramsar Convention. As I indicated to the House back in July, I fully support the underlying thrust of the regulation, and I am committed to phasing out lead shot in wetlands, given that lead is clearly undesirable and can cause harm to the environment and to waterbirds. Many Member States have had restrictions in place for many years on the use of lead gunshot. Ireland, on the other hand, has had no restrictions at all in place. I know that we are not completely alone in that regard, and that there are a small number of Member States which don't have restrictions either, but we are in a minority. It is true for those Member States which have some national regulation already in place. Many gun owners in those countries would have guns with lead-shot ammunition, and any transitional challenges to meet requirements of the proposed regulations would be mitigated by this. In the case of Ireland, as we currently have no restriction, statutory or otherwise, on the use of lead and gunshot, the regulations would pose a challenge to us in terms of implementing and properly enforcing a new regulation in 24 months in a situation where Member States are already more advanced than us in terms of national regulation. I understand that in Ireland, some farmers and hunters' guns may not be capable of using lead substitutes and that may need to purchase new guns. In addition, the definition proposed to be used for wetlands is that defined under the Ramsar Convention, i.e. wetlands of international importance, which includes peatlands. And this would cover relatively large areas around the country. Furthermore, these Ramsar areas are not currently all mapped, and given the scale of wetlands in Ireland, this would take some time, so actual enforcement would present us with some challenges. My department held consultations with interested parties, including hunting and farming interests, on the matter, and while the department has always supported the underlying thrust of the regulations and is committed to phasing out the use of lead shot in and around wetlands, it did make a case for a longer lead-in time to deal with the transitional challenges which I have outlined, and in regard submitted a documentation to the REACH Committee. As the Deputy may recall, which we discussed this on July 16, the Commission has proposed that a vote on the draft regulations was to be taken by written procedure on the day before our discussion, but then decided to terminate that voting procedure. At the time of our last discussion, we were awaiting further clarification on the Commission on how to intend to progress this matter. Since then, the issue was subsequently discussed at REACH meeting held on the 3rd of September. Notwithstanding Ireland's reservation in relation to the lead-in time, and we are committed to phasing out lead shot in and around wetlands, Ireland indicated at the meeting that we would support the draft regulation. A vote was taken at the meeting of the draft regulation, and it was passed by the necessary majority of Member States, with Ireland voting to support the measure. The draft regulation will now be sent to the Council of European Parliament for scrutiny for a period of 3 months. While we do recognise that there will be some challenges to us in terms of implementation, if proposed regulation becomes law, Ireland, like all Member States, will have to raise to the challenge, and we will have to do this in consultation with stakeholders. At the end of the day, I am satisfied that the long-term implications of the regulation will be of benefit to Ireland, its citizens and to the environment.
Minister, that's bizarre. You essentially spent the bulk of your speech reiterating the exact comments that you made at our previous debate, and then which outlined the concerns and the challenges that would be there, and then essentially you said, well, we'll just face down those challenges at a different stage. You mentioned the consultation with some of the organisations that have an interest in this. You didn't state that that conversation took place after the vote. That to me is incredibly disappointing. I know the Green Party spent some time at your online conference asking why it is that people in rural Ireland don't like you, and notwithstanding the suggestion from one of your senators that you should just use smaller words, I can tell you that it's actions just like you've taken that leads people in rural communities to think that your party is out of touch and completely deaf to their concerns. These are the facts. You were presented with a regulation. You were told that this regulation would create huge difficulties for farmers and game clubs, the very people that you need to champion conservation measures and to protect our biodiversity. And you were simply asked to ensure that a full consultation process would take place with them before you supported the regulation, and you couldn't do it. I don't understand why that is the case. So I'll ask you now, will you commit, as Minister, who's made a decision that's going to put a huge burden on a number of gun holders, will you commit to ensure that anybody that's out of pocket because they have to change their guns or have to modify their guns, that they're going to be compensated in full? And will you now commit to consult with those people who will be affected by the implementation of a regulation? And if you say you are, will you outline the process and the nature of that consultation? Because people will take a commitment to consult with a grain of salt. So I'm asking you, in recognition of where we've been up until this point, will you outline the form that that consultation will take place? Minister, whatever needs to be done to protect our environment needs to be done and has to be done. All we're asking, and all I'm asking, is that the people who are on the front line in protecting biodiversity and the environment are consulted before the decisions that are made that affect them are made. I don't think that's too much to ask, Minister.
And to outline, I did, as you said, Deputy, meet with NARGC, and it was after the vote on September the 3rd. And certainly we are committed, and I had a very constructive meeting, I have to say, with them, and it was certainly, there were difficulties there, but we did have a constructive meeting, and I do recognise the conservation efforts and conservation work that the NARGC members do right around the country on great partridge projects and other projects around the country. So I think they do fantastic work in that regard. As a general principle, I am fully supportive of the proposals which lead to the ban of use of lead shot in and around wetlands, and given the environmental threats posed by lead in the environment. At the same time, I do fully appreciate that there will be some challenges for hunters and other gun users to overcome to meet the requirements of this draft regulation, should it eventually be passed by the European Parliament. And my department has liaised directly with farming and hunting stakeholders over the last year or so, and we are aware of the challenges involved. There will be challenges for government in this too. For example, the Commission's proposals for buffer zones of 100 metres around wetlands is an added difficulty in terms of trying to enforce any new restrictions. In following up on a commitment that I gave to the deputies of this House when we discussed the matter in July, I met with the National Association of Regional Game Councils, which represents the interests of the hunters, and we had a very useful and frank discussion on the issue. My department, I would like to add too that I will be meeting separately, specifically with the IFA in relation to this. My department has argued at the REACH Committee that for a transition period of more than 2 years proposed by the Commission, especially for Member States which do not currently have any restrictions, and indeed my department submitted written documentation to REACH Committee in that regard. In that event, as I indicated earlier, notwithstanding our reservations on the transitional arrangement in the draft regulation, the Commission put proposals to a vote without a revised period of transition. Because we are committed to phasing out the use of lead shot in and around wetlands, which I strongly believe is the correct approach, when it came to a vote, Ireland did vote in support of the draft regulation, which was passed by the necessary majority by Member States, and that would have been the case anyway. It is important to point out to the House that we were aware of the vote being taken, irrespective of how Ireland voted, that this proposal would have been carried given the level of support. In those circumstances, I believe Ireland took the correct decision to vote in favour, to signal our support for protection of the environment and protection of health, not just wild birds, but for humans also. But I outline my commitment again to you, Deputy, that I will continue to hold consultation with the relevant stakeholders in this regard to try and address those concerns, and they're valid concerns, and I do want to try and address them in collaboration with the various stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you,